the 21st century, we are confronted by a huge challenge of declining democracy and freedoms and the rise of authoritarian strongmen, not just in non-Western societies, but also in Western societies. Now, in order to meet this challenge, psychology has to change some of its traditional approaches. Like most psychologists, I was trained to do 1-hour laboratory experiments, to think in fairly short-term perspectives. And we have to change from this approach, the traditional approach, the causal model of behavior that we adopt, to a more dynamic long-term perspective to try to understand changes over very long-term periods. Now, the challenge of authoritarianism, of course, is not new. The challenge of reversals from democracy to dictatorship are not new. If we go back to Athens 2,500 years ago, from that time, we've had quite a number of reversals. And one might think that a solution to the problem of dictatorship is to have revolutions. And unfortunately, when we look at the outcomes of revolutions, we find that that is not necessarily a good solution. The Arab Spring, the Iranian Revolution, typically these kinds of revolutions result in one dictatorship being replaced by another. Indeed, if we go back to the great revolutions, the French and the American revolutions, it took a very long time, several hundred years, before these revolutions actually led to actually influenced the outcome, being in terms of a more democratic society. So the question is, why is it that it takes so long to try to move from dictatorship? All major societies began as dictatorships, to try to move from dictatorships to democracy. Why does it take so long? And why is it so difficult? In order to answer these questions, I put forward the concept of political plasticity, which is about how fast and how much we can change political behavior. Now, of course, we've all heard of brain plasticity, but I'm more concerned with plasticity in behavior outside in the real world. And political plasticity is a concept that I use to try to explore changes that are viable and how fast they could come about in the political sphere. In terms of why there are reversals from democracy to dictatorship, there have been a number of very well-informed discussions before. For example, Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom is a wonderful book, focusing on the tensions of the modern world, the anxiety brought about by the modern world, the idea that human beings feel afraid, feel anxiety, because their traditional communities have been broken up, and they seek to relieve their anxiety and their fear by escaping to a dictator, the comfort of being led by a dictator. I don't accept this explanation, but I have another explanation, and the kinds of explanations I'm going to put forward today are all reflected, are based on 3 books. One is The Psychology of Dictatorship. The second is The Psychology of Democracy. And the third one, most recently, Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty. And all of these are published by American Psychological Association Press. So if I don't accept Eric Fromm's explanation, what alternative am I providing? I believe that one of the things we have to do in order to try to explain the 21st century experience of rising authoritarianism and declining freedoms and declining democracy, both in non-Western and Western societies, one of the things we have to do is to distinguish between types of freedom. One type of freedom is the traditional type of freedom, which is about individual free expression, individual movement, the type of freedom that we typically think about when we discuss human rights. The Human Rights Declaration from the United Nations is based on this kind of freedom. But there is an alternative kind of freedom that is particularly supported by authoritarian strongmen. The second type of freedom is attached freedom. Attached freedom in contrast to detached freedom. Detached freedom is about individuals deciding and moving and acting as independent agents. Attached freedom is about freedom through collectives. It is about freedom and glory through the group. It is the kind of freedom that the authoritarian strongman supports and propagates, and the kind of freedom that Hitler was talking about when he talked about the Third Reich lasting 1,000 years, the glory that is achieved through being a member of that group. It's the type of freedom that is discussed when people talk about making America great again and closing the borders to outsiders. Why? Because through belonging to that great America, through sharing the glory of that great America, the individual feels a type of freedom that can only be achieved through that collective experience, through that collective membership. And of course, the authoritarian strongman argues that, or propagates that, it is only he who can lead this group. It is only through his leadership that this group can achieve glory and freedom in the collective sense. And you too can be a member of that glorious group that will achieve wonders historically. So in discussing this explanation of the appeal of authoritarian strongmen in this era, one of the things I do is distinguish between different types of freedom. And I emphasize particularly freedom through collective glory, freedom through collective action. And it is where the individual can become merged with the group, with the collective, become one with others, led by the authoritarian strongman. Of course, this process is taking place in the context of globalization. And globalization is the source of many of the threats that the strongman, authoritarian strongman, is trying to defend against. What is it about globalization that leads to these threats? First, globalization involves the movement of people, and vast numbers of people moving rapidly and interacting with others who are dissimilar to them. This rapid movement of people represents a threat for many nationalists in particular. When nationalists perceive when they see that there are these large numbers of dissimilar others arriving on their borders at very fast pace. Suddenly, 1 million Syrians move from the Middle East to Europe. Suddenly, millions of Mexicans are moving across the US border and coming up from the south. These kinds of rapid movements represent a threat, particularly for those who are personality-wise authoritarian. Now, we have a lot of research in psychology of the authoritarian personality from the 1950s, from the era when psychologists were engaged in this question of what made some Germans support Hitler. Many Germans, but some in particular who were enthusiastic supporters. What was special about them? And it turned out that the authoritarian personality was a key. Authoritarian personalities being the type of people who were categorical thinkers. They were particularly against dissimilar others or minorities right across the board. They were particularly dogmatic in their support of strong leadership, particularly intolerant of ambiguity. And just as they followed the leader, they also hammered down on those below them, those that they saw below them, as dissimilar minorities, as those who were different from the in-group. So one of the key themes here in focusing on the authoritarian personality is that this personality is very similar across the board, across societies, and is characteristic of extremism in religion, in politics. It is a characteristic that some psychologists would claim is only found in right-wing groups, but I believe that authoritarianism is dangerous and also found in left-wing extremists. It really doesn't seem to me to be very different if you are the victim of Stalin or Hitler, whether it's right-wing or left-wing. It's all the same outcome. And of course, I experienced this kind of victimization after the revolution in Iran, when Islamic fundamentalists lost Iranians the chance to have a democracy. Right after the dictator Shah was deposed, Islamic extremism came into power and re-established dictatorship in Iran, now under the leadership of a mullah. So it doesn't seem to me any different if the authoritarian is religious or secular, left-wing or right-wing. The key psychological characteristics of authoritarianism are the same, and their opposition to freedom, to individual freedom, to what I have called detached freedom. The opposition to detached freedom is adamant, and it doesn't matter what the details are. You find the same cluster of psychological characteristics in the authoritarian personality across different societies. So I've argued that globalization has a very important role in raising threats, and one of these threats arises out of the movement of people across borders, and of course the movement of ideas across borders, and the movement of cultures across borders, in large part through the internet. So we have this situation where the in-group is being threatened by invasions. Either it's invasions of Muslims to Europe, or Mexicans in America, different types of invasions. And the authoritarian personality reacts by supporting aggressive leadership, authoritarian leadership, and by trying to expel what they see to be dissimilar others. These problems that have arisen in the 21st century, with a decline in freedoms, decline in democratic tendencies, decline in open societies, and this is all mapped out by groups like Journalists Without Borders, by Freedom House, by other sources that are objectively looking at and monitoring and charting the trends in freedoms around the world. What we have is a decline in freedom. And the question is, well, what can we do about it? What are the options for us? First of all, as psychologists, we have to reorient ourselves. We have to come out of our 1-hour laboratory experiments, and we have to look historically. And we have to think about what I have termed political plasticity. The possibility of changing political behavior, how fast and how much we can change. Let me give you an example of where political plasticity seems to be very limited so far, and how change is very difficult. Consider the topic of leadership. All major human societies over the last 11, 12,000 years where we've had settlements, all major human societies have had leaders. And as far as we can tell, in major societies, most of the time the leaders have been men. In the United States, after such a long time, we still do not have a woman in the White House. We still do not have a change in that respect. Most of the presidents have been older males. Now, this is part of what I call rigidity in political plasticity. It's very difficult to change leader-follower relationships in this respect. Most leaders still continue to be male, still to continue to be of a particular type in terms of personality, in this respect, that they seek power, they desire power, and they tend to very often veer towards authoritarianism when given the chance. So these kinds of rigidities in behavioral change have to be kept in mind by psychologists when we think about solutions to this decline of freedoms and democracy we have experienced recently. Another factor we have to think about is, in terms of rigidities and political plasticity, is a relationship between perceived threat and in-group reactions. In psychology, we know that when a group experiences threat, they typically become more conformist. They typically support strong aggressive leadership. They typically will not tolerate deviance within the group. There are all these factors that serve as rigidities. And as I mentioned, globalization brings with it a number of threats. Of course, there are threats that are not necessarily in the control of any particular government, such as terrorism. Terrorism is a threat, and through empirical research, what we've shown is that when people feel threatened by terrorism, they tend to have lower support for human rights and civil liberties. This tendency that when we feel threatened, our support for civil liberties declines, seems to be another one of the rigidities associated with political plasticity. That is, human beings seem to have evolved in such a way that when they are threatened, when their group is under pressure, when they feel that their life is threatened in a serious way within the group, they react in predictable ways. And one of those ways seems to be to have lower support for freedoms and civil liberties. Now, that's another rigidity in relation to political plasticity. We have to keep in mind all the time that the processes we're discussing really involve context more than individual personality. In explaining the threats to democracy and the decline of freedoms, I'm emphasizing what I call contextual factors, and I've developed a model that I call the springboard model to dictatorship, springboard model, which highlights again the contextual factors that lead to either the continuation of dictatorship or the start of a new dictatorship. Now, what do I mean by the springboard? It's a very simple idea. The idea is that under certain conditions, a springboard comes to life, and this springboard can be used by a potential dictator to spring to power. My argument is that in terms of personality factors, in all human groups, there are potential dictators. We all know this from our colleagues at work and our families. There are always potential dictators in terms of personality factors. Of course, there's always something special about the potential dictator. The potential dictator tends to want power, be narcissistic, be Machiavellian. They have these cluster of personality characteristics, be dogmatic, categorical in thinking. We know these things. But that's not enough to become a dictator. To become a dictator, the next step is the springboard to dictatorship has to be in place. And that springboard comes into place through a number of contextual factors, historical factors, economic factors, social factors. They combine to bring to life this dictatorship springboard. The springboard to dictatorship was in place in the 1930s in Germany. Of course, the potential dictator has a role in bringing to place, in creating the springboard. Hitler had a role in creating the springboard that he used to spring to dictatorship in Germany. And certainly Khomeini, in my experience, had a role in bringing to life the springboard to dictatorship that he used in Iran to spring to dictatorship, authoritarian rule in Iran. We had about a year of relative freedom in Iran from 79 to the beginning of the 80s, but very quickly freedom was snuffed out. And in that time, the springboard to dictatorship was reconstructed by the Islamic fanatics, and it was used by Khomeini to spring to power and to re-establish a dictatorship in Iran. This springboard to dictatorship highlights the importance, the priority of the context in trying to understand dictatorship and how it comes about. It is not just the work of an individual such as Hitler, It is not just the work of an individual with a certain personality type, but it is the individual with the potential to become a dictator, using the springboard to dictatorship to rise to power, to grab power, and then move on and exterminate all enemies. That's typically the way with dictatorships when they begin, unfortunately. So in discussing the rise of authoritarian strongmen in the 21st century, I have highlighted the kinds of threats brought about through globalization. I've highlighted the changing circumstances we're living in. And I believe another of the threats that we have to keep in mind that will be associated with the rise of authoritarian strongmen, another of the threats is global warming. Global warming is going to create a lot of new threats for us, not just in terms of psychological threats, but also real material threats. Global warming is going to bring ruin to many farmers. It's going to bring ruin to many businesses. It's going to bring new opportunities for other people and other businesses. So there's going to be a lot of changes over the next half a century, even as we grapple to come to grips with global warming. We're going to be faced with a lot of rapid change, a lot of rapid disasters through weather, through extreme weather, through all kinds of changes that are going to come about. And this is going to raise substantially the perception of threat. People around the world are going to be feeling threatened. And we know that when people feel threatened, there are a number of predictable reactions. They become more ethnocentric. They become more supportive of strongmen and potential dictators. And they are typically less supportive of civil liberties. All of these things point to greater dangers, and it's important for psychologists to be standing up and pointing these dangers out early, pointing out that we're going to be facing these dangers and we have to make plans. We have to try our best to avert the decline in democracy. Of course, as I mentioned, we have to also think historically. We have to look back to the last 2,500 years at least, and remember that democracy has not been on a smooth upward increase. It hasn't been the case that we have been experiencing greater and greater democracy. The ride has been very, very rough, and it promises to be rougher in the future. Now, what can we do? What are the possibilities for us in terms of what we can bring about as psychologists? What can we do to help democracy survive, to help freedom survive, to support civil liberties, and to prevent the rise of authoritarian strongmen? And of course, this is a grave danger because we can see these strongmen either in power or on the wings waiting to grab power. So this is a severe danger. What could we do as psychologists? I believe one of the things we can do is to put forward ideals and describe their psychological characteristics in terms of what are the goals we are aiming to achieve. This is a very ancient tradition of psychologists and others putting forward some kind of an ideal. And what I did in terms of ideals in democracy. I wrote a book called The Psychology of Democracy and put forward an ideal of the kind of democratic citizen that would be useful in supporting democracy and the psychological characteristics of the democratic citizen. The question is, what psychological characteristics should the democratic citizen have in order to be able to support, to sustain a democracy? Because we know that democracies, in order to thrive, in order to move forward, in order to flourish, they must have democratic citizens supporting them. And the question is, what kinds of psychological characteristics must this democratic citizen have? In the book, The Psychology of Democracy, my goal was to outline very clearly the characteristics of the democratic citizen, the ideal that we should be trying to nurture. And of course, this nurturance comes through education, it comes through socialization, through the family, it comes through ultimately psychologists teaching society the direction it should take with respect to the psychological characteristics of the democratic citizen. Now, the ideal I put forward, of course, is there to debate. It's something that I put forward as an idea. And it has 10 characteristics, this democratic citizen. And it starts with the idea that the democratic citizen must be able to begin any interaction, any dialogue, any negotiation, any process of communications and learning with the acknowledgement that I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Now, that seemed like a very simple step, but actually it's a step that excludes enormous numbers of people. For example, if you are a religious fundamentalist, you cannot begin the process by saying I could be wrong, because your faith in your religion is dogmatic. This is one of the things I faced again in Iran when I was interacting with fundamentalist Muslims. They cannot start the dialogue with I could be wrong, because their faith is dogmatic, their belief is dogmatic, and they begin with the dialogue with you are wrong. Not I could be wrong, but you are wrong. So this beginning that I could be wrong is just one of 10 steps. Second, the democratic citizen must say, I have to critically assess everything, including the sacred beliefs of my society. So it's not just I who could be wrong, but it's my society that could be wrong. So I have to question the sacred beliefs of my society. I have to be willing to bring into questioning everything that is in my society. So obviously, this is not possible if you are an extreme ethnocentric, nationalist, etc. A third step is that I must revise my opinion as the evidence requires. So if I look into myself saying I could be wrong, if I look into my society saying that even the sacred beliefs of my society could be wrong, and I discover that there are things that are wrong, then I have to change my mind about some things. So I have to be open to the possibility of changing my opinion. And again, if you are an extremist of the left or right, it becomes very difficult. Fourth, the fourth characteristic of the democratic citizen is the ability to learn from others who are different. The idea that I must be open in my interactions with those who are different from me. Sometimes they're completely different from me. I must be open to learning from them. Now, again, this creates tensions because as psychologists, we know that in interpersonal and intergroup relations, similarity attraction is the key. Dissimilar others are not attractive to us typically. I know that they are attractive to us in Hollywood movies, but actually psychological research shows that similarity attraction is the key. So being open to learn from dissimilar others is a challenge as well. And fifth, I must seek to better understand those who are different from me. I must seek to better understand those who are different from me. And again, this goes against the trend of similarity attraction that we know well in psychology. And I can learn from those who are different from me. This is very important, being open to interactions with those others who are different from us, being open to learning from us, and even the possibility that we can learn from different others is abhorrent to many people under present circumstances. But I'm putting forward this picture of the psychological citizen as an ideal. Another characteristic of the psychological citizen supportive of democracy is that she or he will seek information and opinions from as many sources as possible, that they will not confine themselves in the way we do often in echo chambers, where we express ourselves only to others who agree with us. So this characteristic is very important of seeking information from different sources, even from sources that we know disagree with us. And I should be open to experiences, to new experiences, and I should be open to creating new experiences for others. This is very much in line with some aspects of what we would like to have in diverse societies. In diverse societies where there are many different groups, the ideal would be to be open to the experiences and cultures that other groups offer us and to open up so that they can learn from us as well. So far, I've emphasized certain aspects of the democratic citizen in terms of personality, what we want to develop, openness, the willingness and ability to question the self and one's own society, to learn from others who are different from ourselves, to be open to new experiences and to share experiences with others. And there is a danger here now, because I've gone through these 8 first characteristics. There is a danger that we will end up with a completely relativistic person, somebody who is not anchored morally. And the last 2 characteristics that I emphasize are for anchoring, are for making sure that this is a principled person and not totally relativistic. So the 9th characteristic of the democratic citizen is that she or he says and believes there are principles of right and wrong, that there are certain principles of right and wrong. And 10th, finally, not all experiences are of equal value. So it's not a situation where this person is going around the world saying, I will experience everything in the same way. There's no difference between um, the telephone book and Shakespeare's plays. No, it's not a relativistic person. It is a principled person who, at the same time, is open to experiences and open to self criticism and criticism of the in group. So, what I've done here is in this book, Psychology of Democracy, I've outlined what I believe to be, in terms of psychological characteristics, the important features of a person who can sustain and support a democracy and help it to thrive. And I believe it is worth talking about such ideals because they help us to focus more on exactly what we are trying to achieve as psychologists and in our relationship with the larger society. Thank you very much. I look forward to further discussions on this. Thank you.